So carbon-14 is one of these radioactive isotopes. And because it's radioactive, it's unstable and it decays. And it has a characteristic half-life. In the case of carbon-14, the half-life is 5,730 years. And so it decays quite quickly compared to the kinds of radioactive isotopes that are typically used to date rocks. So carbon-14 is usually used on organic samples, things like shell or wood or bone, rather than inorganic rocks. And it's also used for what geologists regard as more recent samples, things that are geologically quite young, because it decays away so quickly. So typically you think within about maybe 10 half-lives or thereabouts, you wouldn't really have much of the carbon-14 that was originally in the sample left to measure. So the kind of limit on carbon-14 is usually thought to be somewhere around sort of 50 to 60, 70,000 years, something on that order. Now the interesting issue that's come up is that when we actually look at samples that, according to the standard geological dates, are way older than that, we're talking about millions or even hundreds of millions of years, that are composed of carbon, things like fossil wood or coal samples that were once preserved vegetation. Those samples have carbon-14 still in them. We have collected samples from a whole range of different geological systems across the world, and we find carbon-14 in these samples. What does that tell you? Well, if there's still measurable amounts of carbon-14 in those samples, it can only be either original carbon-14 that was intrinsic to the sample, or it has to be contamination. And I think most scientists kind of dismiss this and say, oh, it must be modern contamination. But despite our best efforts to protect against contamination, we still find this carbon-14 that appears to be intrinsic to these samples. And that tells you that these samples can only be thousands of years old and not millions or hundreds of millions of years old. And so carbon-14 in these ancient fossil materials is a good evidence that actually they were deposited in geologically recent times, consistent with the young age model and inconsistent with the evolutionary old age model.